In a moment, you're going to read a paragraph as part of an experiment, and whether you understand it or not will depend on something that happens before you read a single word. This experiment was first published in a 1972 paper by Bransford and Johnson. It was about reading comprehension and recall. You can check down in the description after the video if you're interested in reading about that. For now, we're going to go ahead and do that experiment together. You don't have to do anything special. What I'm going to do is put a short paragraph up on the screen here in just a second, and when I do, just read along with me. Here we go. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. A mistake can be expensive as well. Now, if that paragraph did not make a lot of sense to you, don't worry. It's not supposed to. Now, we're going to go ahead and try this again, but this time, before you read it, I'm going to give you one small piece of information, which is that this paragraph is about doing laundry. Okay? Now, knowing that, let's give it one more try. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. A mistake can be expensive as well. Okay, so now that you know that it's about doing laundry, the paragraph should have made a lot more sense. And notice how little information that I gave you. The only thing that I did was clarify the context that you use to interpret the sentences. Now, there's a name for that in reading research. It's called schema activation. Schema in this sense refers to the background knowledge that your brain has about the world. What's a restaurant like, for example? Or what's it like to pet a dog or sweep the floor? Or in this case, what's it like to do laundry? This background knowledge serves as a kind of rough model for the way things are supposed to be in any given situation or environment. When you activate schema, you're essentially bringing relevant background knowledge from long-term memory into working memory. So if the text is vague or if there are gaps, then you're easily able to fill in those gaps because everything is being interpreted within that familiar situation or that familiar model. Now, unfortunately, schema activation is kind of a double-edged sword. If the wrong schema is activated, then readers will instead fill in gaps with ideas and expectations that the text never really intended. There's a well-known study by Oded and Stavens. Again, you can check down in the description if you want to read more about it. In this study, they had different groups of students read the same exact text, but for some groups, they gave them comprehension questions that were created specifically to kind of misdirect them, to activate a false schema. And for the groups that were exposed to this false schema, the summaries that they wrote showed that they had misunderstood or at least misinterpreted the author's main ideas. So imagine when you read that paragraph from our experiment a second time, imagine that instead of me telling you that it was about doing laundry, what if I told you that it was about how to clean out the garage? At first, it kind of works. You're arranging things into groups. One pile might not be enough. You're not trying to do too much all at once. But then some of the other details, they seem like kind of a stretch. Now, those inconsistencies aren't going to make us reject the schema outright. Instead, what we're more likely to do is just overlook them because it still mostly makes sense. And therein lies the real danger of activating the wrong schema. A false understanding can take hold in our minds without us even realizing that we got it wrong. So now think about all of the things that you do before you read a book. We get recommendations from BookTube or BookTalk. Maybe we read a synopsis on Goodreads, or we'll at least read the inside jacket or the back cover. Now, in doing all of this, we naturally form expectations about what the book is or what the book isn't, what it's supposed to do for us, or how the story is supposed to work. And most of this is really great. These are the things that you should do, but also think about how some of these things can potentially mislead you. Sometimes there's a lot of unwarranted hype around certain books, for example. Sometimes people will misidentify genres. How many times have I heard someone say that The Road is a post-apocalyptic adventure story? Once in a while, it can even be the marketing of a book. There was an article a while back about a novel called Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. It was printed in this bright cartoon-like cover, and that packaging kind of gives the impression that it's sweet, or at least that it's low stakes, and, maybe kind of typical of what you'd expect of YA. But actually, it contains explicit content and some other adult-oriented themes that you wouldn't expect from the packaging. Now, believe me, I understand the impulse of wanting to just jump in and open up to page one and start reading a book, especially if it's a book that you're really excited about reading. But pre-reading is a long-standing, well-studied technique that activates relevant schema before reading. And when it's done carefully, it reduces the risk of misinterpretation and false confidence by aligning expectations with the text. So what I'm proposing here is just a few extra minutes, and it can make a huge difference in comprehension and memory. Now, there are many different types of pre-reading routines, but what I use is very quick, very simple. It's preview, predict, and purpose. So let's talk about preview first. Now, you're probably doing some of these things already. I mentioned some of these earlier, reading the synopsis on the back, for example, or reading reviews online. Some other things that you can do is read the table of contents, read the chapter headings, look at the diagrams or images if there are any. It's also a good idea to quickly sort of skim over the first few pages, just get a sense of the story, who's in it, what's going on, where are they. Then close the book. Look at the cover art. If it's fiction, try to imagine what scenes or characters are being depicted in that artwork. If it's nonfiction, what does the design say about the book? All right, next is predicting. Now this one's simple. Before I start any book, I try to think of at least one or two predictions based on what I looked at during the previewing process. Most of the time I'll just write what I think the book is going to be about, but sometimes I'll also write what I think the tone is going to be. Is it going to be dark? Is it going to be funny? Is it going to be sad? Now, I keep a reading journal, so for me, this is where every entry starts, with my pre-reading routine. But, if you want to, you can just write it down on a piece of scrap paper, maybe use it as a bookmark or whatever. You just want to be able to look at it later and then adjust your expectations if necessary. All right, last is purpose. Now, usually, no matter what the book is about, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or whatever, usually the author's primary aim is going to be to educate, to entertain, or to persuade. Now, in practice, most books actually do all three to some degree, but one of them is always going to be dominant. So it's just a matter of trying to figure out which one is primary, which one's secondary, and so forth. For example, this book by Steven Pinker, the primary purpose is to educate, but a secondary purpose is to persuade, because he also wants to convince his readers that rationality is a distinct skill set from intelligence or education. And of course, he'll want to do that in an engaging way, so entertaining is part of it too. Now, a lot of fiction falls under entertainment. We often think of fiction as something fun to do or something to help you escape. But when it comes to most of the classics, or especially for more serious works, these broad categories, they kind of fall apart. They're a little too simplistic. So we could say that fiction is entertainment if we simply mean that the author wants to give us a compelling experience. But I want to be careful here, because I don't necessarily mean entertainment as some kind of idle or pointless amusement. And even with that, there are plenty of exceptions. Orwell's 1984, for example, is more of a warning to readers. It's more persuasive in that it wants to change how readers think about power, how readers think about surveillance and ideology. And there are plenty more exceptions where that came from, but I think you get the point. Either way, expectations affect how we read almost immediately. Even small bits of context can turn a vague paragraph into something that feels clear and meaningful, because comprehension comes from words on a page and from the experience and expectations that the reader brings with them.